When you think of the best animated Marvel series, some of the shows that will come to mind are X-Men 97, Spider-Man 1994, Spectacular Spider-Man, and probably a couple other very notable TV series. However, I can almost guarantee there is one show that almost no one would think of as one of the best animated shows Marvel has come up with, and that is such a shame because in my opinion, this series is not only one of the best Marvel animated TV series, it might be one of the best superhero animated shows we've ever gotten. And that's why today we're talking X-Men Evolution is criminally underrated. But before we get into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Alright, X-Men Evolution, let's get right into it. So this series came out in the early 2000s, and in my opinion, this show did a ton of things really well. However, some of the things that it did absolutely perfectly have actually never really been done for an X-Men series, and also weren't really done in the X-Men movies. And first and foremost, it was prioritizing the characters of the X-Men over prioritizing Wolverine. Case in point, there's quite literally a series called Wolverine and the X-Men. And although it was a very enjoyable series, and although the X-Men characters that appear are portrayed very well, you can very much so see that Wolverine is the main character. And when you go to the live action Fox X-Men movies, the main character is quite literally Wolverine. Time and time again, Wolverine is right there front and center. Even if you go back to the original 90s X-Men series, Wolverine was one of the 3 or 4 main characters. So much so that when they did crossovers with other shows like Spider-Man 1994, the character that got the most screen time in those crossovers was Wolverine, only followed by Storm. So this series going away from that and actually focusing on other X-Men characters was something that I really enjoyed. However, they took it a step further because not only did they make it very clear that Wolverine was not the main character, they introduced certain characters that would be the main characters while they were still in high school, whereas Wolverine was an adult. So this gave you a separation between X-Men characters. You would have the adults who are the teachers at the Xavier Institute, and when things got incredibly serious, then the adults would intervene and fight alongside our main characters. However, for the vast majority of the storylines, the main characters were Cyclops, Jean Grey, Nightcrawler, Shadowcat, Rogue, and Spike. And let me just say, Spike is without a doubt one of the best new additions to the team. He was actually created for the show. It absolutely fit within the story, and it also gave us another connection for Storm to have. She was quite literally the aunt of Spike. And speaking about interesting dynamics in this series, one of my absolute favorite things about this show was how they portrayed the relationship between Scott and Jean. We normally get a relationship between Scott and Jean. However, the vast majority of the time, it is already when their relationship has been established. It's when they're adults, so they're already together. However, in this series, they are quite literally in high school. They have not gotten together yet. You do see little inklings of feelings between the two of them, even starting back in season 1. It is more so on the side of Scott Summers. However, when Jean's powers start to go haywire in season 2, the one person that is able to get through to her is Scott. And Jean actually notes later on that the connection he made with her that day was more intimate than anything she had ever felt before. And they do give us little moments like this throughout the series that does hint at their relationship, and it does slowly build to them getting closer and closer until you have the point where Scott Summers is kidnapped by Mystique. He doesn't have any of his gear, so he is quite literally just wandering around the desert blind. He can't open his eyes because anytime he opened his eyes, his optic blast would release, and it destroyed a couple of things along the way. So he is just literally getting his ass kicked over and over again by Mystique and by other people that see the destruction that he caused when he opened up his eyes. And then you have the triumphant moment when Jean does arrive. She is able to see where he is because every time he opens up his eyes, their psyches become linked, and she is able to get a grasp of where he is. And this also ties back to the connection they made back in a previous season season when her powers were going all haywire. And once she does arrive there, she absolutely mops the floor with Mystique, and you get the amazing interaction between Mystique and Jean, where Mystique says, "Oh, what, is this the girlfriend to the rescue?" And all Jean says is, "Yeah, you got that right, lady," and just absolutely blasts her through a wall and goes over to Scott, absolutely saves the day, clutches up the battle, and Mystique is defeated with very little effort on Jean's part. She absolutely wrecks her in that fight, and I actually really like that because the power scaling in this particular universe is pretty consistent for the most part, and I feel like they've definitely showcased Jean's full powers in a pretty awesome way. Mystique should not be on the level of Jean Grey, and the show definitely showed that. And then after this moment, Jean and Scott do officially get together. They have their romantic moment, and they are a happy couple that we actually get to see for a little over a season, as this episode happens, I believe, about episode 5 of season 3. So then they are together for the remainder of season 3, and then they are together for the rest of season 4 to end the series together. So not only do we get to see the buildup of their relationship, the confession of their relationship starting, but we get to see the early days of them being together, them going from students at the Xavier Institute to being teachers there and learning how to teach together, how to properly teach the next generation of X-Men. And that was definitely something that was really cool to see. But speaking of Jean and Scott, one thing that almost always happens when you have this relationship between these two characters is unfortunately the love triangle between Jean, Scott, and Wolverine. However, thankfully, as I mentioned earlier in this video, Wolverine is a full-fledged adult. So in this series, he has absolutely no romantic interest in Jean, so we don't get any actual love triangle between the three of them, which means there's not going to be any infighting between X-Men. Well, technically, because Rogue kind of likes Scott, but luckily that does not go anywhere, and Scott actually nips it in the bud really quick. But I can understand it if people had a little bit of an issue with that, because I wasn't the biggest fan of that. However, I also don't personally like Rogue in this series. She'll actually be one of my only negatives of this series. However, going back to the whole love triangle scenario, I'm just really happy that this series did not retread something that we have seen in so many different X-Men storylines, and that is Wolverine getting in between the relationship of Scott and Jean. And then you have Scott and Wolverine butting heads constantly because of this, whereas in this show, they do butt heads. However, it's more so about their ideologies. They have a great respect for one another, and that's shown time and time again. They only really butt heads in season 3 after the military is actually after them. Wolverine wants to absolutely smoke everyone. However, Scott very rightfully so points out that they're supposed to be heroes. Any one of them could smack down all those military choppers. However, they don't want to be like that, so they use their training and just safely take down every single one of the choppers, make sure every single military personnel is safe in this takedown. And this is probably one of the only clashes that we actually get between Scott and Wolverine. It fits for the story, and it doesn't derail any of the personality traits that have been established for each of these characters up to this point. However, since we're talking about the military situation in this series, we have to talk about one of my absolute favorite aspects of this show, because most of the time when you have an X-Men series, even in the live action movies, the public pretty much knows about mutants. The military is aware of mutants. Wolverine and the X-Men quite literally had the MRDs, which was a specialized unit for mutants specifically. However, a benefit of this show aging down certain characters, you could make things take place before people found out about mutants. So for 2 seasons of this show, mutants technically don't exist to the public eye. Most people don't know about any of these things. And this actually gives us one of the plot lines that I love most about this series. I believe it's the beginning of season 2. Cyclops is in a position where he can save someone. However, a lot of people are around him. So you can see in the moment he slightly hesitates. However, he does still use his powers. Luckily, nobody notices that it was him who did the saving. Nobody other than Charles Xavier. So when he does go back to the X Mansion, they do have a talk about it. And there are a couple things that I absolutely love about not only this whole moment, but the interaction between these two characters. Because you see, both of them acknowledge that what Scott did was right. Professor X also acknowledged that if he was in Cyclops' position in that moment, he would have done the same. The only thing the professor was harping on was the fact that you just need to be careful. You need to be careful and make sure no one can see you. No one can see you using your abilities. I'm doing this for you guys. I'm doing this to help protect you. The world isn't ready yet. And Cyclops states states that he understands that. However, he knew he needed to help. But the thing that really bothered him is that he hesitated. In that moment, he didn't just act to save people. He instead had a second's hesitation to wonder if he should, to wonder if anyone would see him. But to him, that's inherently wrong, because if he is meant to be a hero, if he is going to be someone that wants to truly save people, that should be his top priority, not protecting his identity and the fact that he is a mutant. And this introduces a really interesting concept that this show highlights time and time again. The team of the X-Men having to intervene, however, do so in a very careful way so that people either don't see them or they aren't wiser to their true identities. And this actually leads to them not being able to save people multiple times throughout the series. However, luckily for them, or rather unluckily for them, this secret does not last forever, because season 3 does actually start out with the secret being out, and then we do see the X-Men on the run. That is why some of the X-Men have to go up against some military members. Some of them actually do get captured, and there is a whole rescue operation. Luckily, Beast and Storm are able to kind of solve everything. They get the X-Men exonerated, so they aren't actually being hunted anymore. However, they are still being persecuted. We actually see them go to school and be bullied by pretty much everyone, to the point where at one point, Duncan, who is Jean's ex-boyfriend, decides to kick the shit out of Cyclops. And Cyclops quite literally says, "I'm not going to fight back, because if I do, then I'm proving all of you right." So he literally stands there and just over and over again takes this guy's beating, up until Shadowcat and Rogue do arrive there, and then Duncan and his friends decide it's not worth it. They don't want to fight these two. And it's pretty clear that Shadowcat and Rogue probably don't have too much of an issue using their powers at least a little bit to fight these people, which would make sense because their powers wouldn't be that detectable, whereas if Cyclops used his powers at all, it would be rather obvious that, yeah, he literally used his optic blast, and that's why the library is no longer a library. But speaking of Jean's ex-boyfriend, this also gives us the official breakup between Jean and Duncan, who was her quote-unquote boyfriend for a time. It seems they were on again, off again, even though she was fawning over Cyclops in the previous season and getting jealous multiple times in that season when Scott was around any other girl. But I digress on that point. The interaction between the two of them after Duncan does find out that Jean is a mutant is one of my absolute favorite moments in this actual episode. And that's because he comes up to her and says, "This is actually really awesome. You can help me cheat on tests. You can do all this stuff. I don't mind dealing with your problem." And instantly she freaks out on him and says, "Problem? What are you talking about, problem?" And she absolutely goes off on him. And then she grabs Scott's arm and they walk off. Unfortunately, this is what leads to Scott getting jumped later on. However, if getting jumped by 3 guys means that you get to end up with Jean Grey, I don't think that many people would be complaining about it, especially because, let's be real, if Scott tried at all in this fight, he would have absolutely mopped the floor with these 3 people. So he decided to just take the high road, and guess what happened? He ended up with one of, if not the best girl in this entire series. However, speaking about ending up with a girl in this series, we do actually get a couple other romantic pairings in this show, one of which that I don't think has happened in any other series, and that's actually between one of the members of the Brotherhood and one of the X-Men. That is Shadowcat and Avalanche, which at the start is just a very weird dynamic, as he is a delinquent and all he does is try to push her into committing crimes and push her into doing bad. However, throughout the series, you actually see that he is a good person. When the Brotherhood tries to do bad things and take credit for then saving them, he doesn't want to do it. And when things go south, they derail a train and aren't able to stop it. The entire Brotherhood just says, "Okay, let's cut our losses and get out of here." Avalanche decides to stay behind, and he is the main reason that they are able to contain the blast, and he even apologizes for that moment. He actually does also join the X-Men for a brief time, and you get more progression for him and Shadowcat, and by the end of the series, him and Kitty do actually end up together. It is a very organic relationship that I feel like did really fit in this series. Some of the other characters that I feel like they really did justice to, aside from Scott, Jean, and Kitty, I feel like they executed Quicksilver absolutely perfectly. His character was one of the highlights of this series. Nightcrawler was absolutely spectacular. The relationship that they gave him with Rogue, her being his pseudo sister, and the fact that they both were children of Mystique was a very interesting wrinkle to the story. It gave Mystique actual layers in this show. However, if we're speaking about layers in this show, we cannot forget to talk about how ominous they portrayed Magneto, especially in the beginning of this series. All you would hear is this ominous music. You would hear the movement of metal, and then sometimes you would see a silhouette of him, or sometimes you would just hear his voice, either talking to Mystique or talking to Quicksilver. And these moments moments just really solidified why he was a huge threat and why he was the solidified big bad of this series. And that was something that actually continued not just in season 1 but also to season 2, where they do have that climactic battle. And although Magneto is technically defeated and they actually think he is dead, he was the reason that everyone found out about mutants being a thing, which was all part of his plan. And then season 3 progresses with him actually trying to track down different relics that relate to Apocalypse. And then the series does something that I absolutely love. It gives us the Brotherhood teaming up with the X-Men. Magneto and Charles Xavier coming together to take on Apocalypse. It gives us the quote-unquote death of Magneto at the hands of Apocalypse. Same with Professor X. In that moment, we all thought that these characters were dying. It was quite literally the last season of the show. So it would have made sense if they decide to kill these characters off. And even though they decide not to do this, it actually fits and makes sense, and to me isn't really death baiting. I know a lot of times death baiting can be a real gray area. However, in this series, it definitely fits specifically for these moments, especially because then we get to see certain members of the X-Men having to face off against Professor X, against Storm, and then people in the Brotherhood facing off against Magneto. We see Avalanche and the other Brotherhood members rescuing Kitty and Scarlet Witch from Magneto. And speaking of Scarlet Witch, this might be my favorite iteration of Scarlet Witch. They give her such an interesting backstory in this series. She has so much trauma and yet is still trying to be a good person. However, even despite this, she does still end up being a quote-unquote bad guy, even though of all the characters in the Brotherhood, she's probably the least evil alongside Avalanche. But even still, every single time she does show up, you know shit is absolutely going down. And the way they display her powers are also really cool. She can somewhat manipulate reality. However, her powers are more so based in luck, and she just basically makes everything around her go into chaos. So she is technically warping reality. However, it's more so controlling reality to wreak a lot of havoc around her. And that's something I actually really enjoyed about her powers. The suits in this series are also really cool. Yes, they are mainly all just black. However, they do have some nuance to them. Specifically, the suits for the main cast, mainly Cyclops, Jean, Nightcrawler, Kitty, Wolverine does also get something different, Storm, which is really cool to see. As the X-Men do eventually expand their numbers, the suits do become more bland. However, I feel like that is to highlight that those people are just newbies and they aren't full-fledged X-Men yet, which I actually really like. However, speaking of newbies coming in to be the X-Men, that is when we are introduced, I believe in season 2, to Bobby Drake along with some other characters, and they very quickly make it known that Bobby Drake is going to be the most important of the newcomers, to the point where in season 3, he is going on missions that are involving Apocalypse. He is one of the only newbies that actually gets a ton of screen time and actually gets to go on some crazy important missions. Now, the time with Apocalypse was because he did just decide to stow away. However, they still let him go along, and Professor X quite literally knew he was there the whole time, to the point where when they arrived at the mission site, Professor X looked at Scott and said, "Hey, you should go inform our stowaway that we've arrived," showing that he knew Bobby was there. However, he let Bobby go with on that mission, showing how capable Iceman truly was in this series. And as a big Iceman fan, that was something that I really appreciated and something that I found really, really cool. Quicksilver also is probably my favorite iteration in this series of Quicksilver that we've ever gotten. This is probably the best representation of his powers ever utilized. Anytime he's ever beaten in a fight, it is because Jean quite literally picks him up, or Rogue takes his powers, or Nightcrawler is involved. And since he has the ability to quite literally teleport, these are things that all make sense. So you don't run into the speedster problem that a lot of series and movies run into when they have a speedster. So that's something I definitely appreciate as well. Some of the other really cool things that they did, they actually had Wolverine have ties to Captain America. This is something that happens a lot of times in the comics. It isn't something that we've really seen that much on screen before. However, they do give us multiple flashback sequences of him fighting side by side with Captain America, the bond that they had, and even the fact that the two of them were the ones who saved Magneto from those camps back during World War II. So that was something that was really cool. And I also love the moment in present day during the show when Magneto decides to let Wolverine go, and he gives him a nod mentioning that he was saved by Captain America and Wolverine. So that was a really cool moment there. Probably one of my favorite moments from this series. And getting into the things that I wasn't a huge fan of, I realistically can't think of that many things in this show that weren't absolutely great. As I mentioned, Rogue is not the best in this series. Her characteristics aren't really there at all. They don't really give her any depth aside from her being into Scott. And once they do away with with that, which is relatively early on. She is relegated to pretty much being a nobody in the series. She is used as a plot device to take the powers of every single person between the X-Men and all of the Brotherhood all the way up to Magneto, just to get all those powers to be given to Apocalypse. So it is kind of a shame that her story realistically just becomes a plot device to a degree, and that is virtually all she does in the later seasons. However, she is very integral at the very finale of the series, as she is the one that helps seal away Apocalypse. She takes the powers of a little boy who has the ability to actually nullify all power, so she does take his powers and turns off the machine that Apocalypse is plugged into, and in this moment, her and Wolverine are able to seal away Apocalypse, so I feel like she does get redeemed a little bit by the end. However, the middle parts of her story, and especially in the beginning, just aren't that great, so I would say she is probably the biggest downside of this series. But aside from her, I feel like I absolutely love every single interpretation of every character in this series, and if it weren't for X-Men 97, I feel like every single X-Men character in this series would be my definitive favorite version of the character. And even with X-Men 97 in mind, some of these characters are still my absolute favorite versions of the character. Kitty Pryde in this series is so awesome. She is absolutely goated, definitely a top 5 character in this series, and it is a big shame that X-Men 97 really didn't do anything with her character. Hopefully they do show us her in some way. However, I do not know if it would be able to compete with the version from this series because, as I mentioned before, she is absolutely goated in this series. But I'm interested to hear from all of you guys. Do you think X-Men Evolution is as underrated as I personally think it is? Or do you think it is overrated and you don't really see the hype? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And I'll see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.